Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Tonight we are joined by the Grim Tutors. They make MTG content for all skill levels and all player types. They are an awesome channel and we highly recommend you check them out. Links are in the description below. Now, let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First, we have one of our patrons, Philip, piloting Roxanne, Starfall Savant. This is a food chain deck that seeks to generate infinite creature mana. It then casts its commander over and over and burns out the table with meteorites. Next, we have Oblivion from the Grim Tutors, piloting the wise Mothman. This is also a food chain deck that seeks to generate infinite mana. It then casts its commander over and over, generate infinite rad counters, and kills opponents. After that, we have Colton from the Grim Tutors, piloting the partner pair of Tymna the Weaver and Kediss, Emberclaw Familiar. This deck seeks to use combat as a means to burn out opponents. It uses both of its commanders and the card Hatred to kill each opponent at once. Finally, we have Zeb, piloting the Master of Keys. This deck uses Hoarding Broodlord as a one-card combo to assemble multiple tutor chains to win the game. It can also use its commander for recursion of very powerful enchantments. This video would not be possible without all of the support of all of our sponsors, including viewers like you on Patreon. Tonight's game is actually played by some of our patrons on our Discord. If you want to support this content, be sure to check out the links below. You can also support us by free by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment about your favorite part of tonight's game. Before diving into tonight's game, let me ask you, do you know who Jean Grey is? Many of you likely do. She's one of the most powerful mutants with abilities that rival even the greatest heroes and villains. Her story as the Phoenix is an epic tale of drama, power, and transformation. If you haven't already, I encourage you to explore her incredible journey through today's sponsor, Marvel Strike Force. Marvel Strike Force is a mobile squad RPG where you can assemble your dream team of superheroes and supervillains to battle for the universe's survival against iconic threats like Doctor Doom and Apocalypse. Build and power up your roster, complete missions, unlock gear, and take on other players in exciting PvP modes like Alliance War and Arena. You'll recruit legendary characters from across the multiverse, including Iron Man, Wolverine, Venom, and many more. As you level up your squad, you'll dive into game modes like Campaigns, Blitz, and Arena. New players can unlock up to 17 characters within their first 30 days, including Spider-Man, Deadpool, Thor, and Captain America. And with new characters released regularly, there is always someone fresh to add to your team. Gameplay evolves constantly with new battles and challenges. In addition to campaigns and PvP, you'll find the Alliance War, a massive weekly battle between alliances, along with raids and Cosmic Crucible where you'll face off against other players in high-stakes tournaments. Strategy is key. Create squads with unique hero and villain synergies to dominate your enemies. Use RPG-style tactics in 5v5 battles to vanquish Marvel's most notorious villains. Whether you're a seasoned strategist or new to the multiverse, Marvel Strike Force is the ultimate way to experience the power and drama of the Marvel Universe. There are free character giveaways this month, including Jean Grey and Hercules. There's also tons to do as well. Use promo code DEC24 to unlock What If characters Captain Carter, Star-Lord T'Challa, and Strange Heartless. Download Marvel Strike Force today via my link in the description. A big thanks to Marvel Strike Force for sponsoring today's video. Without further ado, let's kick off this nutty nuclear nearsighted nuptial. Zeb won the Opposite Best Friends challenge and gets to start us off. But Zeb has pre-game action, putting Leyline of Anticipation onto the battlefield. Zeb draws a card for turn and plays an Urza Saga, getting his first counter. He passes. Philip draws and plays a Copperline Gorge. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts Power Balance. The table straps in, and Philip passes the turn. Oblivion draws, plays an island, and ends her turn. Colton draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts Mox Diamond. Power Balance triggers and Philip reveals an Elvish Mystic. Mox Diamond resolves and Colton discards a Wooded Foothills. He taps City of Brass to help cast Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff. All through, Colton passes to Zeb. Zeb draws and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays a Command Tower and ships the turn. Philip draws and plays a Timber Crown Pathway. He casts Elvish Mystic and gives the turn to Oblivion. Oblivion draws, plays a Mana Confluence, and passes the turn. Colton draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Tymna the Weaver. Power Balance triggers, and in response, Philip casts Worldly Tutor. He fetches up a Professional Facebreaker onto the top of his library. Still in response to Power Balance, Zeb casts Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Then Power Balance resolves, and Philip reveals a Professional Facebreaker, casting it for free. Lotho triggers, and Colton loses a life and creates a treasure. Facebreaker resolves, then Tymna resolves. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with Lotho. Zeb takes it, and in his second main phase, Colton pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. Finished up, Colton passes. Zeb draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga triggers. He floats mana and sacrifices it, fetching up a Mana Vault onto the battlefield. He ends his turn. Philip draws and moves to combat. He attacks Colton with Facebreaker and Oblivion with Elvish Mystic. They both take it, and Facebreaker triggers. Philip creates 2 treasures, and in his second main phase, he casts Compost. He casts Scavenging Ooze. Lotho triggers, and Colton loses a life and creates a treasure. Philip ends his turn. Oblivion draws, holds open mana, and passes. Colton draws and casts his other commander, Kediss, Emberclaw Familiar. Power Balance triggers, and Philip reveals an Aldrim's Veil. Colton moves to combat and attacks Zeb with Tymna and Oblivion with Lotho. In response, Zeb flashes in the One Ring through Leyline of Anticipation. It enters, and Zeb gains protection from everything. Then Oblivion takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Colton pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. He plays an Ancient Tomb for turn. He taps it and City of Brass to cast Drannith Magistrate. Lotho triggers, and in response, Zeb activates the One Ring, adding a burn encounter and drawing a card. Then Colton loses the life and creates a treasure. Drannith resolves, and Colton shifts the turn. During his upkeep, Zeb loses the life to the One Ring. During his draw step, he takes a damage through his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2 cards. Zeb passes, discarding to hand size. Philip draws and moves to combat. He attacks Zeb with Facebreaker and Oblivion with Scavenging Ooze. They both take it, Facebreaker triggers, and Philip creates 2 treasures. Philip passes. Oblivion draws, misses her land drop, and passes, discarding to hand size. Colton draws and moves to combat. He attacks Zeb with Lotho and Kediss, and Oblivion with Tymna. They both take it, and Colton gains 2, Kediss triggers, and Zeb takes an additional 2, Philip takes an additional 3, and Oblivion takes an additional 1. Tymna triggers 2 more times, and Colton gains an additional 4 life. In his second main phase, Tymna triggers. In response, Zeb taps City of Brass to flash in an Orcish Bowmasters. Power Balance triggers, and in response, Philip casts Beast Within, targeting Drannith Magistrate. Drannith is destroyed, and Colton creates a 3/3 Beast. Then Philip reveals a Dryad Arbor through Power Balance, then Orcish Bowmasters resolves. It enters, kills Elvish Mystic, and Zeb amasses Orcs 1. With Tymna still on the stack, Colton casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Bowmasters. Bowmasters is exiled, and Zeb gains a life. Finally, Tymna's trigger resolves, and Colton pays 3 life and draws 3 through Tymna. Next, he taps City of Brass to cast Demonic Tutor. Lotho triggers, and Colton loses a life and creates a treasure. He then fetches up a card into his hand. Compost triggers, and Philip draws a card. He plays an Aganjo, Seed of the Empires, as land for turn. Colton gives a turn to Zeb. During his upkeep, Zeb loses 2 life to the One Ring. During his draw step, he takes a damage through his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he plays a Windswept Teeth. Since he can cast anything at flash speed, Zeb holds open mana and passes to Philip. Philip draws and casts Tireless Tracker. He plays Dryad Arbor as his land for turn. Tireless Tracker triggers, and Philip creates a clue. He moves to combat and attacks Oblivion with Scavenging Ooze and Colton with Facebreaker. They both take it, Facebreaker triggers, and Philip creates 2 treasures. He ends his turn. Oblivion draws and taps Mana Confluence to help cast Wishclaw Talisman. Power Balance triggers, and Philip reveals a Misty Rainforest. Talisman resolves, and Oblivion passes the turn. Colton draws and casts Grand Abolisher. In response, Zeb cracks Windswept Teeth, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts Mystical Tutor. He fetches up a Force of Will onto the top of his library. Then Zeb activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 3 cards. Still in response, Zeb casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card. Lotho triggers, and Colton loses a life and creates a treasure. In response, he casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Force. Lotho triggers, and he loses a life and creates another treasure. In response, Oblivion casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card. Red Elemental Blast is countered and exiled, and Force counters Grand Abolisher. Colton moves to combat and attacks Oblivion with Tymna and Kediss. She declares no blocks, and in response, Colton taps Ancient Tomb to help cast Hatred, paying 20 life as an additional cost, targeting Tymna. Tymna gets plus 20 plus 0, then Compost triggers, and Philip draws a card. Then Oblivion takes 23, Kediss triggers, and each other player also takes 23, and Colton gains 66 life. Zeb and Oblivion die, and in his second main phase, he pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. Colton passes. At the end of Colton's turn, Philip activates Scavenging Ooze, exiling Colton's Grand Abolisher. Philip gains a life, and Scavenging Ooze gets a 1/1 counter. The turn moves to Philip. Philip draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. Tireless Tracker triggers, and Philip creates a clue. He cracks Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. Tracker triggers, and he creates another clue. He casts his commander, Roxanne, Starfall Savant. It enters, and Philip creates a Meteorite. Meteorite enters and kills Lotho. Compost triggers, and Philip draws a card. He moves to combat and attacks Colton with Professional Facebreaker. Colton takes it, Facebreaker triggers, and Philip creates a treasure. All through, Philip ends his turn. Colton draws and plays a Badlands. He casts Twin Flame, targeting his own elephant token. Power Bounce triggers, and in response, Colton holds priority and taps City of Brass to help flash in a Dualcaster Mage. Power Bounce triggers, and Philip reveals a Runic Armor Store, casting it. It resolves, and in response to Dualcaster, Philip cracks a clue to draw a card. He cracks another clue and draws another, trying to find an answer. He does not find it, and Dualcaster resolves. It enters, creating a copy of Twin Flame, targeting Dualcaster itself. Colton presents a loop of copying Dualcaster Mage, copying Twin Flame, and creating infinite hasty Dualcasters. Power Bounce's trigger finally resolves, and Philip reveals a Manglehorn. Colton moves to combat, swings with everything at Philip, and Colton wins the game. Philip draws a card for turn and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a taiga onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Vault and passes. Oblivion draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. She passes. Colton draws and plays a mountain. He casts Dragon's Rage Channeler. Colton ends his turn. Zeb draws and plays a Windswept Heath. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Vault of his own. Zeb passes to Philip. Philip draws and plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He casts Outland Liberator. He passes. Oblivion draws and plays an Undergrowth Stadium. She casts Vampiric Tutor to avoid Liberator transforming. She fetches up a card into the top of her library and loses 2 life. Oblivion passes. Colton draws and plays a Scrubland. He casts Drannith Magistrate. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with Channeler. Zeb takes 1, and Colton ends his turn. Zeb draws and plays an Emergence Stone. He casts Felwar Stone. He casts Esper Sentinel. Zeb passes. Philip draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with Liberator. Zeb takes it, and Philip passes. During Oblivion's turn, day becomes night, and Liberator transforms into Frenzied Trapbreaker. She draws and plays a Breeding Pool into play untapped, paying 2 life. She casts Ristic Study. Esper triggers, and Zeb draws. She ships the turn to Colton. Colton draws and moves to combat. He attacks Oblivion with Channeler. She takes it, and in his second main phase, Colton casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer, paying the Ristic tax. Colton ends his turn. Zeb draws and casts Tainted Pact. Ristic triggers and Oblivion draws. Pact resolves, and Zeb exiles from the top of his library until he reveals the One Ring, putting it into his hand. He casts the One Ring. Ristic triggers and Oblivion draws. The One Ring resolves, and Zeb gains protection from everything. He moves to combat and attacks Philip with Esper Sentinel. Philip takes it, and Zeb passes. During Philip's turn, night becomes day. He draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga triggers. He floats mana and sacrifices it, fetching up a Soul Ring onto the battlefield. He plays a Timber Crown Pathway as his land for turn. He activates Outland Liberator, sacrificing it, destroying Ristic Study. He casts Tireless Tracker. Philip ships the turn. Oblivion draws and plays a Beseiju, who endures as her land for turn. She casts Gilded Drake. It enters, and she exchanges control of Drannith Magistrate. She passes. Colton draws and moves to combat. He attacks Oblivion with Gilded Drake. She takes it, and in his second main phase, Colton casts Gamble. Darcy and Esper trigger, Zeb draws, then Colton surveils, leaving it on top. He then fetches up a card into his hand and randomly discards a Beseech the Mirror. He plays a Badlands for turn. He ends his turn. At the end of Colton's turn, Zeb activates the One Ring, adding a burning counter and drawing a card. During his upkeep, Zeb loses a life to the One Ring. During his draw step, he takes a damage through his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Smothering Tithe. In response, Oblivion casts Swan Song, targeting Tithe. Esper triggers and she pays. Tithe is countered, and Zeb creates a 2/2 bird. Zeb passes, discarding to hand size. Philip draws and plays a Dryad Arbor. Tireless Tracker triggers, and Philip creates a clue. He casts Heat Shimmer, targeting Gilded Drake, paying the Esper tax. In response, Oblivion casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, countering Heat Shimmer. He moves to combat and attacks Oblivion with Tracker. She takes 3, and Philip ends his turn. Oblivion draws and casts her commander, the Wise Mothman. It enters, and each player gets a rad counter. She passes. At the end of Oblivion's turn, Colton casts Vampiric Tutor. Darcy and Esper trigger, Colton pays, and then he surveils an Archivist of Ogma into his graveyard. Then he fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. The turn moves to Colton. Colton draws, and in his first main phase, he mills 1 and loses a life. Mothman triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. He moves to combat and attacks Philip with Ragavan and Zeb with Gilded Drake. They both take it, Ragavan triggers, Philip exiles a Manglehorn, and Colton creates a treasure. In his second main phase, he casts Braids, a Risen Nightmare. He moves to his end step, and Braids triggers. He sacrifices Gilded Drake. Then Zeb sacrifices his bird, and each other opponent loses 2 life, and Colton draws 2 cards. The turn moves to Zeb. During his upkeep, Zeb loses 2 life to the One Ring. He also pays to untap his Mana Vault. He draws, and in his first main phase, he mills a Mana Confluence. He plays a Hallowed Fountain into play untapped and passes. At the end of Zeb's turn, Philip casts Beast Within, targeting Drannith Magistrate. Esper triggers and Zeb draws. Drannith is destroyed, and Oblivion creates a 3/3 beast. Zeb passes, discarding to hand size. During his draw step, Philip takes a damage through his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he mills 1 and loses a life. Mothman triggers and gets a counter. He plays a Bloodstained Mire for turn. Tracker triggers, and Philip creates a clue. He cracks Bloodstained Mire, pays a life, and fetches up a Stomping Ground onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. Tracker triggers, and he creates another clue. He casts Food Chain. Esper triggers, and Zeb draws. In response, Zeb casts Mystical Tutor. He fetches up a Force of Negation onto the top of his library. Still in response, Zeb activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 3 cards. He casts Force of Negation for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card. In response, Philip cracks a clue, drawing a card. Tracker triggers and gets a 1/1 counter. Then Force counters and exiles Food Chain, and Philip follows up by casting Birds of Paradise. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with Tracker. Zeb takes 4, and Philip ships the turn. Oblivion draws, and in her main phase, she mills 1 and loses a life. Mothman triggers and gets a counter. She plays a Bayou for turn. She moves to combat and attacks Colton with Mothman. Mothman triggers, and each player gets a rad counter. Then Colton takes 6, and she ends her turn. Colton draws, and in his first main phase, he mills a land. He plays a Command Tower for turn. He casts Reanimate, targeting his Drannith Magistrate. Darcy and Esper triggers, Zeb draws, then Colton surveils, leaving it on top. Reanimate resolves, Drannith enters, and Colton loses 2 life. He casts his commander, Tymna the Weaver. He moves to combat and attacks Oblivion with Darcy, Zeb with Ragavan, and Philip with Braids. Zeb blocks with Esper, and each take the rest. In his second main phase, Colton pays 2 life and draws 2 cards through Tymna. He moves to his end step, Braids triggers, and Heat sacrifices a land. Philip sacrifices a land, then Zeb and Oblivion lose 2 life, and Colton draws 2 cards. He passes, discarding the hand size. During his upkeep, Zeb loses 3 life to the One Ring. He draws, and in his first main phase, he mills 2 and loses a life. Mothman triggers and gets a counter. Zeb activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 4 cards. He plays a Forbidden Orchard for turn. He taps it, giving Philip a spirit to help hard cast Omniscience. To the surprise of the table, it resolves. He casts Tidespout Tyrant for free through Omniscience. In response, Oblivion casts Force of Vigor for its alternate cost, exiling a green card targeting Omniscience and Felwar Stone. In response, Zeb casts Force of Will for free through Omniscience. Force counters Force, and Tidespout resolves. Zeb casts Lotus Petal. Tidespout triggers, and Zeb bounces the One Ring back to his hand. He recasts the One Ring for free. Tidespout triggers, and Zeb bounces Mana Ball. One Ring enters, and Zeb gains protection from everything. He casts Ranger Captain of Eos. He sacrifices it, locking out opponents from non-creature spells this turn. He casts Mana Ball. Tidespout triggers, and Zeb bounces Felwar Stone to his hand. He activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing a card. He recasts Felwar Stone. Tidespout triggers, and Zeb bounces the One Ring. He presents a loop of casting the One Ring, bouncing Felwar Stone, then activating the One Ring, drawing a card. He then recasts Felwar Stone to bounce the One Ring. He does this over and over, drawing his deck. He casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Zeb wins the game. Ladies and gentlemen, what a fun set of games tonight. Congrats to Colton and Zeb on their wins. In Game 1, Colton looked for the right time to strike while slowly building up his advantage over the course of the game. In Game 2, Zeb did the same, waiting patiently and accumulating advantage. When the timer's right, he landed his Omniscience and closed it out from there. The most valuable card in tonight's game, sponsored by Luxury Playstyle, goes to Drannith Magistrate. In Game 2, this card was cast, reanimated, stolen, and almost stolen again. This card warped the game around who controlled it and who was able to cast their commander. Zeb had to find a line that allowed him to only cast from his hand, which provided an extra layer of challenge in his win tonight. A big thanks again to the Grim Tutors for playing in tonight's game. Please check out and support their content. Links are in the description below. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Tune in next time when we duke it out to see who will be king of the competitive EDH table. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.